You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is New York Times best-selling author Keith O'Brien. He actually lives up now. He was from Cincinnati, so he remembers the Big Red Machine, and we're going to talk about one of its most prominent members today on the podcast. But now he lives in New Hampshire, which is in the middle of a heat wave. And New England likes to be like old England and not have any air conditioning. So poor Mr. O'Brien is struggling. Mr. O'Brien, thank you for coming on the podcast.
We're all on a heat wave now, aren't we?
Could be. We are discussing his book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Why? I say this to all of my historian guests. I'm a fan of subheadings. So the rise and fall of Pete Rose, we get that through reading your book for sure, and we're going to go into that. That'll be the main subject of our conversation today. But why do you consider the Pete Rose era the last glory days of baseball?
I would say a couple of reasons. First, and most importantly, while I remain a baseball fan today, and I know baseball remains a popular sport in America and across the world, it does not claim a slice of the American consciousness as it did in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when Pete Rose was at the peak of his fame. It simply doesn't. The television audiences were massive. The importance of the game was far more central to the American consciousness than it is today. And that begins to change even in the time that Pete Rose is playing. Pete Rose is a rookie in 1963. As many listeners will know, he was banned from baseball in 1989, 26 seasons in the big leagues. And in that time, things do begin to shift. And by the time Pete Rose is banned, football, the National Football League, has already eclipsed Major League Baseball as America's most popular sport. But I think more important, Robert, than just the popularity of the game or the importance of the game is just how the game was played. There are moments in this narrative where things go sideways on the field, fights, arguments, fisticuffs. Most prominently, I would say, the 1973 playoffs between the Cincinnati Reds and the New York Mets. There's an epic fight that day, which I would argue is the biggest fight in postseason baseball history, between Pete Rose and Bud Harrelson out at second base, that then spirals into a benches clearing brawl that leads to other fights on the fringes. After that fight, there is mayhem in the stands at Shea Stadium in New York. They're pelting the field with bottles and trash. They're trying to actually hit Pete Rose with the trash. Twice the game has to be shut down. At one point, Yogi Berra, the manager of the Mets, sends a contingent of Mets players, his most popular players, including Tom Seaver and at that time, Willie Mays, out to the left field bleachers to calm the crowd because they were in danger of forfeiting the game, a game that they were winning at that point. Despite all of this madness, not a single player is ejected. Nothing. There's no suspensions. There's no fines levied. There's no 5-day hand-wringing investigation from ESPN. The game goes on. It was a rougher game. It was a tougher game. It was a game that was more raw and less polished. And in that way, I think it was just objectively speaking more exciting.
Would you also define baseball in this time period as more honest?
If you're suggesting with your question performance enhancing drugs, then I would say absolutely. One member of the Big Red Machine, of course, is George Foster. George Foster, who plays a couple of seasons for the minor leagues in Indianapolis. And he was one of the most feared hitters of the day, of the time, has 2 seasons of 50 home runs, and does it, of course, with no performance enhancing help. This will also change by the end of the 1980s, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but I would make the argument as a fan that the steroid scandal to come would cast a pall over baseball far greater than the one created by Pete Rose's gambling problem and gambling indiscretions.
Heard it described this way: baseball is still America's pastime, but football is America's passion. Clearly, there is a difference in popularity. Would you also say the Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan era in the 80s and mid to late 90s also has played a role in the diminishing of baseball in the national consciousness, which I think is a halfway decent way of putting it?
I think there's a whole host of factors that led to the diminishing of baseball in the American consciousness. The NFL's rise is certainly part of it. The rise of the NBA in the 1980s with Bird and Magic, as you said. But then, of course, Jordan, Kobe, Shaq, many other big names to come. I think all of that plays a part. And I think the game itself it has itself to blame. We mentioned the steroids a minute ago. The explosion of offensive numbers in the late 1990s as a result of the performance enhancing drugs would lead to very lucrative contracts for the men who were at the forefront of that offensive explosion. Barry Bonds, of course, at the top of that list. Every other player, whether they were using performance enhancing drugs or not at that point, begins to swing for the fences. You can chart, statistically speaking, a decline in league batting average over the past 25 years. Fewer hits, fewer movement on the bases, more strikeouts. In the time that Pete Rose played, it was embarrassing to strike out. It was embarrassing to strike out 100 times a year. Nobody wanted to do that. Today, the analytics will tell players, don't worry about strikeouts. We don't want a little hit in the hole between first and second, a little single. We'd rather you swing hard and strike out or hit a double off the wall. And I think all of that makes the game less interesting to watch. But of course, we're talking about this subtext, really, and that's what I would consider it, subtext for my narrative. I do think it's important, but it is subtext. At the crux of the book, of course, is the story of Pete Rose and this epic fall, an epic rise. And I think when you look at the Pete Rose story, as I did, that it's just far bigger than a baseball story. I think we were drawn to Pete Rose as fans, as Americans, because Pete Rose is really a walking embodiment of the American dream. It's the thing we tell ourselves and tell our children and tell our grandchildren at night. If you work hard, if you try hard, if you hustle, anything can happen. That is the Pete Rose story. It was a true and legitimate underdog story. and he does scrape and claw his way to the mountaintop. I think today, in an era driven by analytics and travel baseball at the youth levels all the way down to age 8 and 9, we would never see a Pete Rose. He would never exist. I think it's frankly a miracle that he even came to exist in his own era in the late 1950s and early 1960s.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is New York Times best-selling author Keith O'Brien. We are discussing his book, Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. So here on the Leaders and Legends podcast, after we do a little bit of foundation conversation, we don't bury the lead. So Mr. O'Brien, you are the Pontifex Maximus of all things Baseball Hall of Fame. Are you letting Pete Rose in?
So my book is not a case for Pete Rose. It's not a case against Pete Rose.
That's a great point.
I think everything that's been written about Pete up until this point is tinged and often laden in every sentence, in every word, in every paragraph with the author's opinion of who Pete Rose is. He's either, of course, the lionized hero who was wrongly exiled from the game, or he's a bad man who did many bad things. I'm here to tell you he's both. And I tried with my book to look at Pete's story through the prism of history, tell that story with granular reporting, interviews with people who were in the room, on the field, in the dugout, including 27 hours of interviews with Pete Rose and interviews with 3 different men who placed his bets on baseball, his closest friends, his inner circle. So that's what I wanted to do with the book, tell that story, let people come to their own conclusions. But of course, like you and every other fan, I have my own personal opinions. And about the Hall of Fame, I will say 2 things. And the first is for context for the listeners. When Pete was banned in 1989, he agrees to this banishment. He assigns a document with Commissioner of Baseball Bart Giamatti that agrees to his lifetime banishment from the game without agreeing to the facts of the case. It's a really ham-handed legal document that, frankly, Pete should have never signed, not in this way anyhow. But when he does sign it, he knows full well that his name is going to appear on the ballot at Cooperstown 2 years later in 1991, which would have been 5 years after his last at-bat as a player. He knows it's going to appear there. There is no rule that restricts him from the ballot or the hall at all. It is only in February 1991, about 9 or 10 months before the ballots get sent out to the writers, that the Hall of Fame changes the rules and states that only players in good standing, only players who are eligible to play the game are eligible to appear on the ballot. It is effectively the Pete Rose corollary. For the very first time in the history of the Hall of Fame, they have essentially precluded a player from appearing on that ballot. And the writers, the voters, are livid at the time. Even writers who had no intention of voting for Pete wrote blistering columns complaining about this decision. Because as they said at the time, the Hall of Fame, who had entrusted them to make good decisions for decades, now didn't trust them to handle this very toxic case of Pete Rose. So I say all that for context because we could have sorted this out 30 years ago. We could have decided and put to bed this debate many years ago. And I think it would have been better for baseball if we had. That said, my personal feeling about the Hall of Fame at this point is this. I think we have lost perspective. We like to put players on pedestals. We like to ascribe to them moral values that they may or may not deserve, that they may or may not have. And the fact is, we simply do not know that much about these players. I would argue we will know even less about the players going forward into this modern time, in a time when the gatekeepers restrict reporters from even having any access whatsoever to the athletes themselves. And so for all of those reasons, Robert, I believe that players should be enshrined or not enshrined based on what they did on the field or on the court, in between the lines. And then if what they did off the field is so wrong, so egregious, let's put it in bronze in Cooperstown, right next to their accomplishments. Let's put it there for perpetuity. And so for all those reasons, to answer your question, I would put Pete Rose and all of the other ne'er-do-wells, and by that, the steroid users and performance-enhancing drug users, into the hall. And I would put them there with whatever clarifying language you want to put on the plaque to make clear what they did either to get there or what they did off the field to stop themselves from getting there.
It's safe to say that Pete Rose is a hometown kid, excuse me, done well. He was born in Cincinnati. He had a domineering father, which you detail. I can only imagine Pete Rose's father as a little league travel baseball dad. Rose loved the game. He worked hard at the game. He played his dues for baseball. He worked hard outside of the diamond, off the diamond, to prepare himself for baseball. I forget what's the story you relate. He worked as some sort of industrial worker, and it built him up, made him strong. What was his gig?
Yeah, after his first season in the minor leagues, in the lowest rung of the minor leagues, by the way, a rung of baseball so low that it doesn't even exist anymore, Pete Rose returns to Cincinnati, and this is the winter of 1960. 1961. And he tells reporters as he's leaving Geneva, New York, where he'd played minor league his first year, that he wants to work in a sporting goods store, but that's not the job Pete gets. Pete comes from a working class neighborhood on the west side of Cincinnati, and he gets a working class job working at the railroad downtown on the west end of downtown, in the shadow, actually, of Crosley Field, the old ballpark where the Reds still played at that time. And that winter, he loaded and unloaded freight cars at the rail yard.
Built up some strength, added to the enhancement of his game. You mentioned in 63, he gets his shot, so to speak. Sorry, Marge, for the play in the big leagues. On a scale of 1 to 10, with all the distractions, with his parents, with everything else going on in his life, how would you rate just Pete making it to the big leagues? 10 being a miracle, 1 being you're born with your Barry Bonds and your dad is Bobby Bonds.
It would be very high. It would be, say, a 9 at that point. Pete Rose enters the 1963 season down at spring training, just objectively speaking, 4th on the depth chart at second base. There is an entrenched starter with the Reds by the name of Don Blasingame, who is very well liked in the clubhouse, even though his game is diminishing at that point. And there are 2 minor leaguers who are, just objectively speaking, ahead of Pete Rose. One will make the big leagues and will be familiar to many baseball fans from this era. His name was Tommy Helms. The other one has been essentially forgotten to history. His name was Bobby Klaus. Both of these men were considered better fielders or better players overall than Pete Rose. That said, Pete had put together 2 really great minor league years. The 1961 campaign down in Tampa and the Florida State League at the A-ball level was in some ways historic. Pete Rose not only led the league that year in triples, he set a league record that still stands. And then the following year, he reports to Double-A Macon, Georgia, the Macon Peaches, and again has a great year. So he is now a good player and a strong prospect. But no one thinks he's going to make the big club heading into spring training, except perhaps one man, and that's Fred Hutchinson, the manager of the Reds. Fred is a former major leaguer, a pitcher, and something happens between Fred Hutchinson in Pete Rose that will happen many times over the course of Pete's career and life. Fred sees something in Pete that he likes about himself. Fred had made it to the big leagues on grit and tenacity. He was never considered a gifted pitcher. He was a pitcher who dominated batters almost through his own willpower. And what does Pete Rose do? The same thing. That hustle, that grit, that tenacity, that's real. And Fred likes that about him and begins to play him more and ultimately gives him that spot on the major league roster that spring. And it's probably at least a year early for Pete to get that spot. And that matters because, as fans will remember, Pete Rose hangs on to the bitter end to try to pass Ty Cobb and that all-time hit record. He needs every single season, every single month, just in order to get there. And if Fred Hutchinson doesn't give him that shot in 1963, maybe Pete doesn't get there.
Pete Rose paid his manager friend back a little bit, perhaps, by being named the National League Rookie of the Year in 1963. Something else happens that considerably alters Pete Rose's life in the early to mid 60s, and that is he gets married. And at one point, I would have to say, Carolyn Rose is probably the most famous sports wife in the country. How did they get together, and what did it mean for Pete to get married so young?
Pete and Carolyn meet in a place that will be important for Pete Rose. They meet at the racetrack, the horse track on the east side of town in Cincinnati, a place called River Downs. And they meet in the summer of 1963, Pete Rose's rookie year. I interviewed both Pete and Carolyn about this. And both have a similar story. She was an attractive woman, an outgoing, gregarious personality, and she was wearing a low-cut miniskirt dress down on the rail that day. Pete spies her through his binoculars, and goes to meet her. And probably what draws him to her, aside from her looks, is their earliest interaction. Pete Rose in the summer of 1963 is now the starting second baseman for the Cincinnati Reds, which is the biggest game in town. And when he introduces himself to her, he expects, of course, that she will know him. And Carolyn Rose does not. She doesn't care about baseball. She doesn't particularly care about sports. And thus begins a quick and torrid romance that will lead to a wedding in January of 1964, before Pete Rose has even started his second season in baseball. And even some of his teammates thought this was a mistake. Pete had an eye for women. This, by the way, will not stop, even though he has gotten married. And at his wedding in January 1964, at least some of his teammates who were there perplexed as to why Pete is marrying and is marrying so young. But as you said, Carolyn will become a star in her own right. Certainly the most famous athletic wife in Cincinnati, and absolutely one of the most famous athletes' wives in the country by the mid-1970s. This woman who did not know much about baseball, does dedicate herself to the game, becomes a prominent fixture at Reds games, behind the dugout, behind home plate, and she will cheer loudly for her husband, and at times even get in arguments with opposing fans because she doesn't like the way they're cheering.
Let's talk about that a little bit. We have a situation in the 60s where you're transitioning out of the Yankee dynasty that basically started in the 20s. So it's not Yankees versus Dodgers or Yankees versus insert team here every year. You have Detroit, the Tigers and the Orioles and the St. Louis Cardinals, even the Minnesota Twins were good. Obviously, the A's come later. So you could say that the 60s was is it fair to say the 60s were a good time or a successful era for Pete Rose individually? He makes the All-Star team, I think 4 or 5 times. He wins a batting title in 68, wins another one in 69, wins a gold glove in 69. He's already been named Rookie of the Year. So as the 60s comes to a close, Rose is firmly ensconced as one of the best players in the game. But the Reds aren't really matching Rose's particular level of success. What is the watershed moment in your view, or moments, for Pete Rose's team success with the Reds at the dawn of the new decade, the 70s?
I would say it's three things. It is Bob Halsam, the general manager of the Reds, joining the team from the St. Louis Cardinals in the mid to late 1960s. It is the drafting of a star that will soon eclipse Pete Rose, the drafting of catcher Johnny Bench. And then it is choosing before the 1970 season to fire a beloved manager of the Reds who had been part of the organization for years and replacing him with a man who will also later make the Hall of Fame, manager Sparky Anderson. I think those three things in the 60s set up the team for the future success that will come. But I think it is also one more move in the early 1970s that will finally push the Reds over the top. And that's Bob Halsam choosing to trade a couple of his star players for, at that time, an underachieving infielder for the Houston Astros, himself now a future Hall of Famer, Joe Morgan. Those moves are ultimately, in my opinion, the crucial ones that will set up the team for success by the mid-1970s.
Were there people comparing at the time, or maybe Rose himself, to someone, say Wilt Chamberlain, got all the records, putting up these amazing numbers, but just didn't have the level of team success that he wanted? Chamberlain ends up winning a title in 67, another one in 72. But how did Pete balance team success versus individual success? How very much important was it for him to have a World Series ring as opposed to 10 Gold Gloves or Silver Slugger awards?
Yeah, anyone who knows anything about Pete Rose knows that Pete Rose loves Pete Rose. And he did have three stated goals before every season. He wanted to hit 300. He wanted to compile 200 hits, and he wanted to score 100 runs. Those were his stated goals before every season. And it is notable, I would say, that he doesn't say, and I want to win a World Series. But I think the criticism that Pete was a selfish player is, I think, a bit unfounded. He is absolutely selfish. And yet, without the World Series titles to come, and the success in the postseason to come, Pete Rose would have never have become the icon that he does become. And so the Reds will lose the World Series in 1970. And then they will lose the World Series in 1972. They will enter the 73 season as favorites, and they won't even make it to the World Series, losing to the Mets in that series I mentioned before. And going into the 1975 World Series, another series that they were heavily favored to win, the pressure was absolutely on. And if it goes differently, I think the Pete Rose narrative is absolutely different.
And you would say, without any hesitation, that during this time, late 60s to the mid 70s, that Johnny Bench is the most feared and most popular fan player on the Reds.
Absolutely.
And that caused some friction, even though they had business endeavors together.
Yeah, there's a couple things that happens. One, Pete Rose is a Cincinnati native, born and raised. And when Johnny becomes a prominent star in 1969, 1970, Pete is significantly older than him. And not only is Johnny becoming a star on his team, he's becoming a star in Pete's hometown. And in some ways, while Johnny is from Oklahoma, he does represent the Cincinnati ethos in a way that Pete does not. Pete was brash. Pete was loud. Pete was an iconoclast. Pete liked to drive flashy cars and be flashy. Cincinnati was and in many ways still is a conservative Midwestern city. And Johnny represented that for a lot of people in ways that Cincinnatians appreciated. Pete Rose did and said whatever he wanted. Johnny Bench did and said all the right things all the time. And Johnny does become more popular than Pete and instantly is just different than Pete. And it's not just because he's better spoken and he says all the right things. Johnny gets an apartment in a hip urban East Side neighborhood called Mount Adams, while Pete is still living on the West Side. Johnny is single while Pete is married. Johnny's bachelorhood becomes a subject of many stories, driving his popularity even higher. And yes, while they're business partners in the earliest days of Johnny's rise, that will soon end. And there is friction between these two men that in some ways will, last to today.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. It's presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today is Keith O'Brien. He's a New York Times best-selling author. We're discussing his latest book. It is your latest book, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
I thought so. I had a moment of doubt there. Forgive me. It just came out a few months ago. Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Two things very quickly before we move into the World Series era of Pete, which would be 1970 through 1980. He gets the nickname Charlie Hustle from Mickey Mantle. I want a nickname from Mickey Mantle. Not just George Costanza naming his kid Seven, but I want a nickname. But it's not a compliment. So A, address that, please. And B, from the time that he makes it to the big leagues, gets married, fathers children, just two, I think, at this time, then how does his gambling, his love of the wager persist throughout just the 60s as he starts to turn the corner to what is he has one of the most successful decades of any baseball player in history?
So one thing I wanted to do with the book was build out the story of Pete Rose, especially around crucial turning points, games, moments, both on and off the field. And absolutely one of those is when he gets the nickname Charlie Hustle. And so I did a lot of work around that, trying to actually even pinpoint the moment, the game, the day and ultimately I did. It happened during a game at spring training, 1963. Pete Rose still never tasted major league success, trying to make the big club. It was Sunday, March 17th, and the Yankees were playing the Reds at old Al Lopez Field, the spring training home of the Reds down in Tampa. It's a huge deal because these are, as you mentioned before, the preeminent Yankees of the day. It's Mantle, it's Maris, it's Yogi Berra, it's Whitey Ford, the tail end of this dynasty. And here's Pete Rose fighting tooth and nail to make the big league roster. And he plays that day with a fury that we will come to know later. He leads off the game, gets on base, scampers all the way around, scores the first run. He later breaks up a double play, sliding hard into second base in a practice game. And then to lead off the fifth, Pete Rose does something that, frankly, Mickey Mantle would never do and cannot understand, especially in a practice game. Pete Rose drops down a bunt for a hit. And some kind of discussion takes place on the steps of the visitors' dugout, the Yankees' dugout, between Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. And I think it's important to point out that Ford and Mantle are really the opposite of Pete Rose. They were two men who were touched by the hand of God with innate baseball talent. And they're essentially laughing at this kid, rookie, nobody, Pete Rose, playing so hard. And what they call him that day isn't totally clear. In the days to come, there are differing accounts in the newspapers. Some newspapers say that they called him Henry Hustle. Other newspapers say that they called him the Charlie Hustler. And it's only in the days to follow that the press settles on a story that the press likes. And they say that they called him Charlie Hustle. And as you said, it wasn't intended to be a compliment. They thought he was playing too hard. It was sarcasm, really. But Pete Rose does with this nickname something that he will do many times over the course of his life. I think in some ways he's still doing today. Pete Rose rebrands this moment. He rebrands this story and repurposes it for his own uses. And when he does make the big league roster that year, and he does visit cities he never thought he'd visit in his life, and meets sports writers in those towns for the very first time, he tells them the story of the day that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle because he liked the way Pete played. And this nickname, I think, is significant. I think it will be one reason why fans will gravitate to him. And I think it is also, to close the loop on your question, one reason his indiscretions off the field will be overlooked for so long. Based on my reporting in my book, Charlie Hustle, at least by the late 1960s or early 1970s, Pete is already betting with bookies on the west side of Cincinnati. Not on baseball, but on football, on basketball. He is living at the racetrack on the east side, to the point that people will write letters to the editor in conservative Cincinnati complaining about it, that Pete is spending too much time at the track. Again, based on my reporting, by 1975, there are concerns within the Reds clubhouse that he is hanging out with, quote, bad guys. Yeah. And by 1978, again, based on my reporting, there is some kind of meeting that happens in the front office of the Cincinnati Reds that includes Pete Rose, it includes the president of the Reds, Dick Wagner, and it includes the head of security for Major League Baseball. And this meeting in 1978 is about Pete Rose's gambling, it's about Pete Rose's relationships with bookies, and it's about his debts to bookies. And this is a full 11 years before the gambling scandal will explode across the national landscape.
Describe in one word, if you can. You mentioned earlier in the podcast about baseball being rougher and tougher, maybe grittier, 40, 50 some years ago. Can you describe in one word Pete Rose destroying Ray Fosse at the plate in the 1970 All-Star game in Cincinnati?
The word I would use is unforgiving. It's an unforgiving play. And I say that without judgment. I think
the All-Star game used to be a huge deal. You and I are probably, I'm definitely old enough to remember that the All-Star game was not this exhibition. It was like, we want to win. And if the American League lost 6 or 7 games in a row, it was embarrassing for whichever league was on the other end of that, was on the end of that losing streak. So I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add to that how big that event was. Midsummer Classic.
Yeah, I think in the past 54 years, because that's how long it's been since the Ray Fosse Pete Rose collision, and the sweeping changes in America and the sweeping changes in the game of baseball, we look at this play and we think that it must be a sign of some sort of character flaw and to be clear, it is a sign of his character without question. But when you go back and you read the coverage in the newspapers across America of all the baseball beat writers who were there that night at Riverfront Stadium, and I'm talking about when papers across America, there is a differing view of the play. People don't wake up the next morning chastising Pete Rose for it. Some do. But some defend him in the moment, including all the managers on the field that night, several Hall of Famers, including one who listeners will certainly recognize, who has a prominent role in Major League Baseball's front office today. That's Joe Torre, the catcher for the St. Louis Cardinals and Pete Rose's all-star teammate that night. As Torre will say later, when discussing collisions in general at the plate, Torre will say, what do you want a runner to do? Slide politely around the catcher? But of course, that play, collisions of that ilk have now been litigated out of the game by new rules and other collisions to follow that we found as fans to be unsavory. And we could no longer tolerate that kind of play. But to go back to your original question, it was an absolutely unforgiving move. And it would, in my opinion, forever alter the arc of both men's careers. I would argue that this is the moment, this collision in the All-Star game in 1970, that Pete Rose becomes Pete Rose. He becomes Charlie Hustle. He becomes the icon that he remained to be for the rest of his life. And it's also the moment when a young Ray Fosse, the Johnny Bench of the American League, will suffer a shoulder injury that will hamper him for the remainder of the 70 season and the next season to follow. And I think forever alter his career in a negative way.
Let's move on to the World Series, but very quickly, you do a terrific job in the book, Charlie Hustle, describing that night, the previous night where Fosse and Rose were at dinner together. And you can watch the video of it where you can see Pete's about to head first slide, realizes that's not going to work. So it wasn't like that as he rounded third, he was taking a shot at this guy. But do you think, yes or no, real quick, do you think Rose would have done the exact same play if the All-Star game was in Forbes Field, Pittsburgh?
I do. He's playing that night, of course, in front of his hometown fans and his father and his wife and President Richard Nixon, this very important local crowd. But I do think he does the same play. One element of the video that you mentioned is that Pete Rose doesn't go home on his own. The third base coach, Leo DeRocher, a future Hall of Famer, then the manager of the Chicago Cubs, and also, I think it's worth pointing out, a notorious gambler in his own, waving Pete down the line. He's running Pete all the way home. Even in the photographs that are captured of the collision, you can see DeRocher in the background, and he's probably only 30 feet away. He has run Pete all the way home, and he's telling you, gotta go, you gotta go, you gotta go. This was a walk-off hit in the bottom of the 12th in the All-Star game.
The Reds win the World Series in 1975, beating the Boston Red Sox. As a Reds fan, it was wonderful to me, although I did watch it at the foot of my dad, who was a Red Sox fan and was told I couldn't clap or be happy about it. 1975, Pete Rose is named World Series MVP. 1976, they go 108-54. In 75 and 76, they go 102-60. Johnny Bench has his worst year as a professional, but comes alive in the World Series by winning the MVP award. The Reds win back-to-back world championships. Then the Reds trade Tony Perez, and it all starts to go to hell, which if you look at interviews with Reds players from then, they still can't believe it in 2024 that Perez was traded. Rose then leaves, joins the Philadelphia Phillies. They win a World Series in 80. And so now Pete has won 3 World Series in 6 years. He's the king of the diamond, no doubt about it, even though he's in his upper 30s by this point, which I didn't know he was that old when he went there. So that was another part of your book that I enjoyed, that revelation. The gambling doesn't end. So now we're in the late the early to mid 1980s, Pete's still having some success, clearly not what he had in the previous decade. His marriage is falling apart. He's still out there catting around. At what time or what year do you think there was an opportunity for Pete Rose to change the arc of his baseball memory?
It is up for debate when Pete Rose begins to bet on baseball. It's not clear. There are very scant few written records of his gambling. What I can tell you based on my reporting and the written records that I've seen is that it begins as early as 1986. That's the betting on baseball. Right after the season begins in the spring of 1986, based on a betting notebook that one of his close friends kept at the time, Pete begins to bet on baseball games, which of course is the ultimate sin that will get him banned from the game 3 years later. I think, though, the real problem for Pete is the choices he's making in the bookies he's using. He has been betting with bookies by the mid 1980s for at least 15 years, if not longer. And in the earliest iterations of Pete's gambling, these were Cincinnati bookies, West Side bookies. At times, they were family friends, people who would protect a young Pete Rose. They weren't going to dog him all over town for his debts. They would carry his losses for a while. They would carry it maybe forever, and they would protect him. And I know this for a fact. He bets, Pete does, in the early 1970s with a man named Alphonse Esselman. He was one of the best known gamblers, bookies in Cincinnati in the 1960s and 70s. And Al Esselman gets in trouble multiple times, including in the early 1970s. He gets picked up by federal authorities for his bookmaking operation. And he has an opportunity at that point, of course, to cooperate and perhaps reveal information that maybe would have gotten him a lighter sentence. But Al Esselman doesn't do that. And I know that because I requested under the Freedom of Information Act, Al Esselman's FBI file. And there's not a single mention of his clients. There's not a single mention of his cooperation. There's not a single mention, of course, of Pete Rose. He protects Pete Rose. But by the mid-1980s, when Pete has returned to Cincinnati, he's returned from Philadelphia and Montreal. He's now hanging on, trying to eclipse Ty Cobb and the all-time hit record. He begins to bet with bookies who he doesn't really know. He's doing it with bookies who are on the fringes of the mob, and he's doing it with a bookie north of Cincinnati by the name of Ron Peters. And as one of Ron Peters' associates told me in an interview for the book, he was worried for Pete from the moment he knew that Pete was betting with Ron Peters, because as the associate told me, he knew that if Ron ever got in trouble and ever got himself ensnared in a federal sting, as ultimately Ron will, he will not protect Pete Rose. He will not protect anyone except for Ron.
Does Pete start to become aware, people who have addictions, who suffer from them, eventually whatever they're doing to feed that addiction isn't enough? So they need to feed it longer, higher, better, more lucratively, in different places. Does Pete understand what's going on with his addiction, with his career? Is he, because he doesn't come off in your book and in the other interviews I watched to prepare for this podcast as a self-reflective guy. Certainly not. He relies on his celebrity to skate, like all celebrities do. But is there any point where he has to say, thinks, man, this is legal in one sense, but it's not ethical or moral in another sense. And I have a problem because what I used to do to feed my problem 10, 15, 20 years ago, it's not quenching the thirst. I got to do something else.
Pete has only twice even come close to saying that he had a problem. The first time is in 1990, after he's been banned from baseball. And he's now facing his own federal charges for tax evasion. And before the judge seeking a lenient sentence, he does say that he was addicted to gambling. And then he makes a sort of mealy-mouthed confession of that in his 2004 memoir, My Prison Without Bars, a memoir that he was widely criticized for because it was seen as a superficial attempt to get himself back into baseball's good graces. Other than that, Pete has really been defiant that he was not addicted to gambling. My reporting shows otherwise. I did interviews with everyone in Pete Rose's inner circle in the 1970s and 80s. And in particular, the mid-1980s, I think, is crucial. Mm-hmm. And my interviews with those men make clear that Pete Rose was absolutely addicted to gambling. He could not stop. He was making poor choice after poor choice. And Pete Rose has received a lot of criticism over the years for lots of things. And I would say, in general, that Pete Rose deserves all the criticism he has. What does an addict do when confronted with the truth of the wreckage they're creating in their lives and the lives of others? An addict diminishes and denies. And so to me, knowing that, it isn't all that surprising that Pete Rose will lie to Bart Giamatti, the commissioner of baseball, in 1989 when confronted with the allegations of his gambling. It doesn't surprise me that he will lie to special counsel for Major League Baseball, John Dowd, when John Dowd digs up a mountain of evidence suggesting very clearly that he's betting on baseball. Pete Rose can't do it. He can't be honest. And for that, he is going to go down.
How much did Rose enjoy the 44-game hitting streak? How much did he lament its end? He comes across in your book as just freaking bitter at poor Gene Garber.
Yeah, this is the 44-game hit streak in the summer of 1978. As baseball fans will know, that's 12 games short of the all-time record 56 set by Joe DiMaggio in 1941. I do think it's worth pointing out that Pete's record of 44 is the largest and longest hit streak we've seen since 1941. And Pete fully believes on the night that it ends in August 1978 that he's going to blow right past 56. The Reds at that point have 12 games in a row against some of the worst teams in baseball, the San Diego Padres and the Atlanta Braves. And Pete had the previous season batted like 350 and 400 against those teams. He was absolutely confident that he was going to break DiMaggio's record. And I think so were the Reds. Again, on the night that it ends, the Reds have called ahead already to San Diego, where the streak would have been broken 12 days later, to say, prepare for a crush of media that's coming, because it was already following Pete in Atlanta. Baseball is a funny game. It's a game of millimeters, a game of tiny margins. And on the night that it ends, Pete Rose has two incredible hits. One is a comebacker to the mound that 99 times out of 100 goes right past the pitcher, but it doesn't. On this night, the pitcher reaches out and stabs it with his glove and makes the catch. And then later he hits a line drive down the third base line that, were it 6 or 8 inches in any other direction, gets right past the third baseman, but it's literally right at the third baseman's glove. It's an out again. And so, it comes down to a final at bat under the most dramatic scenario, in a way that could only, frankly, happen to Pete Rose. With 2 outs in the 9th, the game is immaterial at that point. The Braves are going to win, but 50,000 people are on their feet at Fulton County Stadium cheering effectively for Pete Rose against the pitcher, Gene Garber, their own guy. And I did lots of interviews for this book, Robert, as over 160 hours of interviews, many of them with former players. And I was fortunate enough to do 2 nights of interviews with Gene Garber. And I got to tell you, they're interviews I'll never forget because certain people are forever defined by one moment, one night, one game, one play, one argument, one wager with Pete Rose. And it follows them forever. And that is absolutely true of Gene Garber. If Gene played today, he would have been a multi-time all-star as a reliever. And who knows, maybe he would have been a borderline Hall of Famer. But in the 60s and 70s and 80s, relievers were considered role players. They didn't make all-star teams. They didn't make headlines. And Gene Garber will really only make headlines for this one night with Pete Rose, where he will prevail and Pete will be livid about it.
I love the question. And was it the Cincinnati writer who said when Pete was complaining, because Garber was famously a sidearm submarine pitcher, like Kent Tekulve was another one to come to mind in that era, actually. And basically Pete's upset because of the way he was pitched to, and they were like, it's not how all I could think of was Hal McRae, who played for the Reds, but it's somebody else.
Hal McCoy
says,
Daily News.
Yeah, says if the roles were on, if he had a 44 inning hitless inning streak, wouldn't you try to do all you can to end that streak and get a hit? Which I thought was the perfect comeback. We have just a few more minutes with Keith O'Brien, author of Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. I have 5 questions I ask all of my guests. I'm going to ask you one more before we get to those. It's July 9th, 2024. Does Pete Rose get into the Hall of Fame while he's alive?
I don't think so. I think that Pete Rose has burned every bridge that was ever available to him. And I think at this point, the strategy, if there is one, for Major League Baseball and the National Baseball Hall of Fame is to play out the string and make decisions after he's gone. I will say this as a caveat, though. We've seen even this year a lot of gambling scandals in sports. We've seen even this year several gambling scandals in baseball. I think it's just the beginning. I think there will be more. I think there will be more in baseball. And I think inevitably there will be a gambling scandal involving a fairly prominent baseball star. And when that happens, there will be conversations anew about Pete Rose and what to do with him. And if there's anything that can move the needle on Pete Rose while he's still alive, it would be that. Scandal after scandal to the point that we simply can't remember why we ever banned Pete Rose in the first place.
Fair to say it would be the baseball equivalent of giving Reggie Bush his Heisman back?
Although much bigger.
Agreed.
The Pete Rose Hall of Fame debate is one of the great late night sports arguments of all time. The Reggie Bush Heisman Trophy debate is just one of a litany of a million NCAA scandals. This is far bigger, and what the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Major League Baseball would never want is a Pete Rose living and vindictive and standing on a stage at Cooperstown, rubbing everyone's noses in it. It's just not going to happen.
That's a great point. Although, as a Notre Dame football fan, if Bush had gotten what he deserved 20 some years ago, there would have been no Bush push. So
there you go.
I had to sneak that in there. We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Keith O'Brien, are you ready? These are short.
I'm ready. Let's roll.
What was your first job?
I was a bagger at Thriftway grocery store in Cincinnati, Ohio.
What was your first concert?
The Kinks, 1980s.
Big Kinks fan. Most underrated band in history. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh my gosh, that is so hard. Any book, my goodness.
No wrong answers.
Yeah. Wow. I'm going to recommend just what came to mind first. A book written by a friend of mine just came out in the last year. King, A Life by Jonathan
Eig. Yeah.
Won the Pulitzer Prize this year. The definitive biography of Martin Luther King. It humanizes one of our great American icons.
He is supposed to come on the podcast.
Fantastic.
I'm looking forward to it.
Number
4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Wow. Years ago, I had the opportunity to visit Normandy and the American cemetery at Normandy. I believe in the history of Western modern civilization, there is probably only a handful of days more important than June 6, 1944. I guess I would have wanted to see that.
I was there about 6 weeks ago, and I just tell people, take your Kleenex. You're going to need it. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Oh my gosh. I love your questions, Robert. This is great.
Thank you very much.
I would choose, in the summer of 2024, in this particular moment that we're living in right now, I would choose to have dinner with Joe Biden and his team, because it just feels like there's so many secrets and so much information that we all want to know, and we just don't know.
He needs your help. I'll say that in as nice a way as possible. Our American political system needs help. So let's just be candid there. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today has been Keith O'Brien, New York Times best-selling author. We're discussing his latest book. It's a wonderful read. It's like a time warp back to, as he says, baseball's glory days. Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball. Thank you so much, Mr. O'Brien, for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.